body lay frozen in the snow, 20 feet from a cabin that should have kept him alive. James Crawford had stumbled outside in the middle of the night, delirious from hypothermia, and collapsed before he could find his way back to his door. His cabin, the one he'd built the proper way, had dropped to 18 degrees inside despite the fire burning when he fell asleep. He never woke up to add more wood. 40 yards away, beneath the frozen prairie, Erik Halvorsen slept warm in a pit dug 6 feet into the earth. Above him, a fire burned on a stone platform, radiating heat downward through packed clay into the underground chamber where he lay wrapped in furs. His thermometer, a small brass instrument he'd brought from Norway, read 68 degrees. Outside, the Dakota wind screamed at 43 below zero. When Erik emerged the next morning through his ladder shaft, he found Crawford's body. He found 2 more bodies that week, the Patterson children, ages 6 and 8, frozen in their beds when their family's firewood ran out. By the end of January 1881, 11 people within 5 miles of Erik's homestead had frozen to death. Every single one had died in an above-ground cabin. Every single one had been heating their shelter from the inside, fighting the cold with fires that burned through wood faster than anyone could cut it. Erik's underground sleeping pit, the structure everyone had mocked as a grave, as a hole fit for animals, as the most ridiculous shelter ever built on the Dakota prairie. That pit stayed between 65 and 72 degrees through the entire winter. He burned fires only during daylight hours, never at night. He used 1/5 the firewood of his neighbors, and he never once felt cold while sleeping. The settlers had called him crazy. They'd said he was digging his own grave. They'd laughed at the Norwegian who wanted to sleep underground like a badger. Then winter came, and Erik's grave kept him alive while their proper cabins became actual graves for 11 people. Erik Halvorsen was 53 years old when he filed his homestead claim in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1880. He'd come from Finnmark, the northernmost region of Norway, where winter temperatures routinely dropped to 50 below zero and the sun disappeared for 2 months. He'd spent his entire life in conditions that made Dakota seem almost mild by comparison. But Finnmark had taught Erik something that Dakota settlers didn't understand. The earth itself was the best insulator and heat source available in extreme cold. In Finnmark, the Sami people had survived for thousands of years using underground and semi-underground shelters. Norwegian farmers in the far north built gami, earth-covered dwellings that stayed warm through the darkest, coldest months. Erik had grown up in a culture that understood ground temperature stability. When Erik arrived in Dakota and saw how American settlers built their cabins, he knew immediately they were making a fundamental mistake. They built above ground, on stone piers, or directly on the frozen earth, with log walls exposed to the howling wind on all sides. They built fireplaces inside their cabins, fighting to push heat into a space that was losing heat through every wall, every gap, every square inch of surface exposed to the killing cold. Erik would build differently. He would build into the earth, using the stable underground temperature as his foundation. He would build his fire above his sleeping chamber, letting heat radiate downward into earth that would store it and release it slowly. He would create a shelter that worked with the physics of heat rather than fighting against them. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. Erik began his excavation in July 1880, when the ground was soft and workable. He chose a slight rise on his property, high enough that water would drain away, not pool in his pit. He marked out a rectangle, 10 feet long, 8 feet wide. Then he started digging. The first settler to comment was James Crawford, whose claim bordered Erik's to the south. Crawford rode over when he saw Erik waist-deep in a hole, shoveling dirt into a growing pile. "Building a root cellar?" Crawford asked. "Sleeping chamber?" Erik replied. "A what?" "Underground room for sleeping. Is Norwegian method?" Crawford stared at him. "You're digging a hole to sleep in? Like an animal? Like a warm person? Underground stays same temperature all year, warmer than cabin in winter. That's the strangest thing I've heard. You'll wake up in a coffin full of water when the rain comes. Will drain properly. I've built these before." Crawford rode away, shaking his head. The Norwegian was digging himself a grave and calling it a bedroom. Some people weren't meant for frontier life, but Erik continued digging. He went down 6 feet, deep enough that he was well below the frost line, deep enough that the earth temperature would remain stable regardless of surface conditions. The excavation took him 3 weeks, working alone with shovel and pickaxe. He removed removed approximately 480 cubic feet of earth, piling it carefully nearby for later use. The walls of the pit were vertical, cut cleanly into the clay-rich Dakota soil. At 6 feet deep, the soil temperature was a constant 52 degrees, cool but dramatically warmer than the -40 air temperatures that winter would bring. Erik's next step confused his neighbors even more. He lined the pit walls with logs, not horizontally like cabin walls, but vertically. Thick poles set side by side, creating a wooden barrier between the earth and the interior space. The logs were 8 feet tall, extending from the pit floor to 2 feet above ground level. "Why logs underground?" a settler named Morrison asked. "The dirt walls would hold just fine. Logs stop moisture from seeping in, also create air gap between earth and living space, is better for dryness. Seems like wasted wood to me. Wood is plentiful here, will not waste." Between the vertical logs and the earth walls, Erik packed dried grass and leaves, creating an insulating layer that would also help manage moisture. This wasn't primary insulation. The 6 feet of earth above the frost line would provide that. This layer was for moisture control and secondary thermal benefit. The floor of the pit Erik lined with flat stones, then covered with packed clay, creating a surface that was clean, dry, and would radiate any captured heat upward toward the sleeping area. He built a simple wooden sleeping platform about 18 inches off the floor, with storage space beneath for his supplies. By late August, the underground chamber was complete, a room 10 feet by 8 feet, 6 feet deep, with log-lined walls, a stone and clay floor, a wooden sleeping platform, and walls extending 2 feet above ground level. It looked like a rectangular pit with a log fence around the rim. Then Erik built the roof, and this was the element that made everyone certain he was insane. The roof of Erik's underground chamber was unlike any roof the settlers had seen. He built it from thick logs laid horizontally across the pit opening, creating a ceiling about 7.5 feet above the pit floor. But instead of covering these logs with simple sod and calling it done, Erik did something completely different. He covered the logs with a layer of flat stones, mortared together with clay. This stone layer was about 4 inches thick, heavy but supported by the substantial log beams beneath. Then he covered the stones with 6 inches of packed clay, creating a massive thermal barrier between the underground chamber and whatever would be above. On top of this stone and clay layer, Erik built a fire platform. The fire platform was a shallow pit, about 5 feet in diameter, lined with stones and ringed with a low wall of rocks. It sat directly on top of the underground sleeping chamber, separated from the chamber below by only the log ceiling, the stone layer, and the clay layer. About 14 inches of material total. "You're building a fire on top of your bedroom?" Morrison asked, incredulous. "Yeah, exactly. Fire heats stones and clay. Heat radiates downward into sleeping chamber below. Very efficient. Heat rises. Everyone knows heat rises. Your fire's heat will go up into the sky, not down into your hole. Radiant heat goes in all directions, up, down, sideways. Fire heats stone platform. Platform radiates heat in all directions, including down. Chamber below receives heat through ceiling. That's backwards. You should build your fire inside your sleeping room, not on top of it. Fire inside room consumes oxygen, creates smoke, requires chimney. Fire outside, on top, has none of these problems. Smoke goes to sky, heat goes into thermal mass. I breathe clean air below." Morrison shook his head. The Norwegian had built his heating system upside down and his sleeping room underground. It was the most backwards construction anyone in Dakota had ever seen. But Erik wasn't finished. He surrounded the fire platform with a low wall of sod and earth, creating a windbreak that would protect the flames from Dakota's relentless wind. He built a simple entrance to his underground chamber, a shaft at one end with a ladder leading down, covered by a small wooden shed that blocked wind and snow from entering. The entrance shed had a door that sealed tightly. When closed, the underground chamber was essentially airtight, connected to the outside only through the soil itself, which allowed minimal air exchange. This was critical for the system to work. The chamber would stay warm because it couldn't lose heat through air circulation. Finally, Erik covered the entire structure, the sod walls around the fire platform, the entrance shed, everything, with additional earth and sod. By September, his underground sleeping chamber was invisible from a distance. You'd see a low mound with a small shed at one end, and a fire pit on top. You'd never know there was a room beneath it. The settlers called it Erik's hole, or the Norwegian's grave. They joked that he'd already buried himself to save someone else the trouble after he froze. They were absolutely certain his system wouldn't work. The first hard freeze came in mid-October. Temperature dropped to 15 degrees overnight. Erik descended into his underground chamber in the evening after burning a fire on the platform above for 3 hours. The results were immediate and remarkable. The stone and clay layer of the roof had absorbed heat from the fire, reaching temperatures of perhaps 150 degrees on the upper surface. That heat conducted slowly downward through the 14 inches of material separating the fire from the chamber. The log ceiling of the chamber felt noticeably warm to the touch. Not hot, but warm like sun-heated wood. The chamber air temperature was 62 degrees when Erik entered. Outside, it was 15 degrees. He sealed the entrance door, lay down on his sleeping platform, and monitored the temperature overnight. By morning, the chamber had dropped to 58 degrees. The stone platform above had cooled, but was still releasing residual heat. The earth walls, stable at 52 degrees, were actually warming the chamber air rather than cooling it. The floor radiated gentle warmth from heat stored in the clay. Erik emerged to an exterior temperature of 12 degrees. His chamber was 46 degrees warmer than outside. He'd burned no fire during the night, used no fuel, and slept in perfect comfort under fur blankets. He tried to explain the results to Crawford. Chamber stays warm because Earth at 6 feet depth is always 52 degrees. Fire on top adds additional heat. Stone platform stores heat, releases slowly, is very efficient. 52 degrees isn't warm, that's cold. Is 40 degrees warmer than outside tonight, and that is without fire. With fire during day, chamber reaches 65-70 degrees. Your cabin would be warmer with a proper fireplace. My cabin would require constant fire all night, would use much wood. This system uses fire only during day, stays warm all night. Much more efficient. Crawford remained skeptical, but as October progressed into November, he noticed that Erik seemed comfortable while everyone else was already struggling with the cold. As temperatures dropped, the efficiency of Erik's system became increasingly apparent. His routine was simple: build a fire on the platform above his chamber in the morning, let it burn for 2 to 3 hours while he worked around his homestead. Build another fire in the evening, let it burn for 2 to 3 hours. Then descend into the chamber, seal the door, and sleep warm all night on stored heat. Total daily firewood consumption, 20 to 25 pounds. His neighbors' cabins required constant fire to maintain temperature. They were burning 80 to 120 pounds of wood per day. Their cabins were warmer than Erik's chamber when fires blazed, perhaps 75 degrees near the fireplace. But the heat was uneven. Corners far from the fireplace dropped to 40 degrees. Floors were cold, and the moment the fire died, temperature plummeted. Erik's chamber maintained consistent temperature throughout. There were no hot spots, no cold corners. The earth walls radiated stable 52-degree warmth from all directions. The ceiling, heated by the fire platform above, radiated additional warmth downward. The overall effect was enveloping comfort, not the intense heat of sitting by a fire, but the even, moderate warmth of being surrounded by gentle heat sources. By December, temperature was consistently below zero. Erik increased his fire duration slightly, 3 hours morning and evening instead of 2, but his wood consumption remained far below his neighbors. He was using roughly 1/4 to 1/5 the fuel they were burning. The temperature differential was stark. On December 20th, when exterior temperature was 25 below zero, Crawford's cabin, 42 degrees, with fire burning continuously. Morrison's cabin, 38 degrees, with fire burning. Erik's underground chamber, 68 degrees. Fire had been out for 6 hours. Erik's chamber was 26 to 30 degrees warmer than the best performing cabins, and he wasn't burning any fire at the time of measurement. The thermal mass above and the earth around the chamber were doing the heating work, releasing stored energy accumulated during the daytime firing. January brought the worst weather anyone in Dakota Territory could remember. A massive Arctic air mass settled over the region. Temperature dropped to 35 below zero on January 8th. By January 15th, it had reached 43 below. Wind made conditions even more deadly, creating wind chills that could kill exposed skin in minutes. The extreme cold lasted for 4 weeks. Temperature never rose above 5 below during that period. Nighttime lows consistently hit -40 or colder. Wood supplies that had seemed adequate were consumed at catastrophic rates as settlers fought to keep cabins even marginally habitable. Erik's system continued working. He increased his fires to 4 hours morning and evening, using perhaps 40 pounds of wood per day. still a fraction of what his neighbors burned. His chamber maintained temperature between 65 and 72 degrees throughout the extreme cold. The physics were straightforward. His chamber was surrounded by earth that maintained 52 degrees regardless of surface temperature. The ceiling, heated by fires above, added warmth on top of the Earth's base temperature. The system only needed to generate 15 to 20 degrees of additional heating above the Earth's natural warmth, far easier than generating 60 to 70 degrees of heating above ambient air temperature like cabins had to do. On January 12th, James Crawford froze to death. He'd been burning wood desperately, going through his reserves at unsustainable rates. That night, exhausted from cutting wood in the killing cold, he'd fallen asleep by his fireplace. The fire had burned down. Temperature in the cabin dropped. Crawford, already hypothermic, had stumbled outside in confusion, a common symptom of severe hypothermia, and collapsed in the snow. Erik found his body the next morning. Over the following 3 weeks, 10 more people died. The Patterson children on January 16th. Their parents had run out of firewood and couldn't maintain temperature. A bachelor homesteader named Wilson on January 18th, found frozen in his bed. The Morrison family's elderly grandfather on January 21st. Hypothermia, complicated by age and illness. A young couple, the Hendersons, on January 24th. Their cabin's chinking had failed, and they couldn't maintain temperature despite constant fire. The deaths were concentrated among those with inadequate fuel supplies, poor cabin construction, or medical vulnerabilities. But even the best-prepared settlers were struggling. Everyone was burning wood at rates they couldn't sustain. Everyone was cold, tired, and frightened. Erik opened his underground chamber to survivors. The Morrison family, after losing their grandfather, spent 4 nights in Erik's pit while Morrison cut more wood. A widow named Sarah Patterson, after losing her children, stayed with Erik for 2 weeks, unable to face returning to the cabin where they had died. At one point, 5 people crowded into the 10 by 8-foot underground chamber, cramped but alive and warm. The chamber maintained temperature even with additional body heat. The earth walls provided stable baseline warmth. The fire platform above continued radiating stored heat downward. People who'd been shivering in cabins for weeks finally slept warm for the first time since December. The extreme cold broke in. Mid-February, temperature rose to a comparatively mild 10 below zero. Survivors emerged to count the dead and assess the damage. The toll was devastating. 11 people dead within 5 miles of Erik's homestead. Nearly every cabin had been damaged by the extreme cold. Chinking cracked, doors warped, roofs stressed. Firewood supplies were exhausted across the settlement. Erik had used approximately 35% of his winter wood supply. He had plenty remaining to finish the winter. His underground chamber showed no damage. The earth-sheltered construction was unaffected by temperature extremes that had stressed every above-ground structure. Morrison organized a meeting at the nearest trading post. 21 survivors attended. The discussion was sobering. "We lost 11 people," Morrison said. 11 people in 4 weeks. Every one of them died in an above-ground cabin. The only person who stayed warm through the entire crisis was Erik with his underground sleeping pit. He turned to Erik. "You tried to tell us. You explained how it worked. We called you crazy. We laughed at you." "Was not crazy," Erik replied quietly. "Was old knowledge. In Finnmark is normal. Underground stays warm in winter, cool in summer. Earth is stable. Is physics, not magic. Can you teach us to build these?" Erik spent the following weeks conducting workshops. He explained the principles, digging below the frost line where Earth temperature was stable, using that stable temperature as baseline warmth, building the fire platform above to add supplemental heat that radiated downward, using thermal mass to store heat and release it gradually. The key insight was the fire placement. Everyone had assumed fires belonged inside sleeping spaces, but fires inside required chimneys, created smoke problems, consumed oxygen, and produced heat that rose and escaped. Fires above an underground chamber had none of these problems. Smoke went directly to the sky. Heat radiated downward through thermal mass. The chamber below received warmth without pollution, without oxygen depletion, without any fire-related risks. The technical explanation involved concepts the settlers didn't fully understand: radiant heat transfer, thermal mass, ground temperature stability, but the results were undeniable. Erik's chamber had stayed 65 to 72 degrees, using 1/4 the firewood, while cabins struggled to maintain 40 degrees despite burning constantly. "Why doesn't everyone build this way?" someone asked. "Because it's more work to build. Digging 6 feet down is hard labor. It's easier to build cabin on surface. But easy to build does not mean easy to heat. Underground is harder to build but easier to live in. Modern analysis explains why Erik's system works so dramatically well. First, ground temperature stability. At 6 feet below the surface in Dakota, ground temperature remains approximately 50 to 54 degrees year-round. This temperature reflects the annual average surface temperature, modulated by the Earth's massive thermal inertia. Surface temperature can swing from -40 to +90, a range of 130 degrees. 6 feet down, the swing is perhaps 5 degrees. The Earth acts as a massive thermal buffer. Second, baseline temperature advantage. Erik's chamber started at 52 degrees as a baseline. He only needed to add 15 to 20 degrees of heat to reach comfortable temperatures. A surface cabin at -40 needed to add 110 degrees of heating to reach the same comfort level. Erik's heating load was less than 1/5 of a surface structure's. Third, radiant heat transfer downward. Contrary to the settlers' belief that heat rises, radiant heat travels in all directions. The fire platform above Erik's chamber heated the stone and clay mass, which then radiated heat equally upward and downward. The downward radiation warmed the chamber ceiling. The upward radiation was lost to the sky, but this loss was acceptable because the earth below provided baseline warmth. Fourth, thermal mass heat storage. The stone and clay platform above the chamber weighed approximately 1 ton. This mass absorbed heat during the hours of active burning, then released it slowly over 12 to 16 hours. The system provided continuous warmth from intermittent fuel input. Fifth, minimal heat loss. The underground chamber lost heat only through the entrance, which was small and sealed, and through the earth itself, which was at 52 degrees, minimizing temperature differential. A surface cabin lost heat through every square foot of wall, floor and roof exposed to -40 air. Erik's heat loss was perhaps 1/10 of a comparable cabin's. The efficiency advantage was approximately 8 to 1 when calculated properly. Erik achieved comfortable heating with 1/8 the energy input of surface structures. In survival terms, this meant the difference between running out of wood in January and having supply remaining in April. By summer 1881, 6 settlers in the area had built underground sleeping chambers following Erik's design. They discovered the summer benefit he'd mentioned. The chambers stayed cool in hot weather, providing relief from August heat just as they'd provided warmth in January cold. The design spread slowly through Dakota and into Montana and Minnesota. By 1890, Norwegian pit shelters, or earth lodges, were known throughout the Northern Territories. They never became common. The construction effort deterred most settlers, but those who built them swore by their effectiveness. Erik Halvorsen proved up his homestead claim in 1885 and continued living on his land until his death in 1903 at age 76. He expanded his underground system over the years, adding a second chamber for storage and connecting them with a short tunnel. His grandson, interviewed in 1952, remembered visiting grandfather's cave as a child and being amazed that it was warm in winter and cool in summer without any visible heating or cooling. The original sleeping pit collapsed in the 1940s after decades without maintenance, but the excavation is still visible as a rectangular depression on the property. The winter of 1880-81 entered Dakota history as the Long Winter or Hard Winter, the same brutal season that Laura Ingalls Wilder later described in her book. The death toll across the territory was substantial, with many communities losing 5 to 15% of their population. Erik's settlement lost 11 people out of approximately 90, a mortality rate of 12%. Not one person died in an underground shelter. The technology that seemed primitive, that settlers mocked as animal-like, that violated every assumption about proper construction, that technology proved superior to every civilized building method when conditions became extreme enough. Everyone mocked Erik Halvorsen's underground sleeping pit. They called it a grave. They said he was burying himself alive. They laughed at the fire on top, said heat rises, and his system was backwards. They knew that proper people built proper cabins above ground with proper fireplaces inside. Then 43 below zero arrived and stayed for a month. Erik's grave maintained 70 degrees. 11 of his neighbors actually died in their proper cabins with their proper fireplaces, built the proper way. The system that everyone mocked was the only system that worked when conditions exceeded what proper construction could handle. The earth at 6 feet stayed 52 degrees, while the air above dropped to -43. The fire platform radiated heat downward through thermal mass, while cabin fireplaces sent their heat up chimneys into the frozen sky. The sealed underground chamber retained warmth for 16 hours, while drafty cabins lost heat faster than any fire could replace it. James Crawford's body lay frozen in the snow, 20 feet from his proper cabin. Erik's underground pit glowed with warmth beneath the prairie, heated by the fire burning on top, insulated by the earth on all sides, maintaining 70 degrees while the world above tried to kill everyone in it. Sometimes the crazy idea is the only idea that works. Sometimes primitive is just another word for proven. And sometimes the person everyone laughs at is the only person who survives.